welcome to a conversation that is really going to get into the practicalities of how do we really transition from a relationship that has been configured on donor-recipient configurations to this aspirational relationship that we've been talking about today of partnership, of shared value, and of shared prosperity. Now, one of the things that we heard earlier on this morning is that we're given a context, and the context was that by 2050, almost a quarter of the world's population will come from Africa. And what this tells us, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is now an obligation to really look at the relationship between Europe and Africa. But what we also heard this morning is that if we look at our trade numbers between the two continents, we're looking at about 36% of trade. However, with this demographic shift, if we want to ensure that that 36% grows substantially and exponentially, we're going to have to rethink and reconfigure the relationships. Now, a lot of things were shared already today. There were questions of trust. How do we build trust between the two continents? Bubbling under and simmering under, and we're going to bring this to the surface, were questions of mindset. What does this look like in terms of reconfiguring the mindset? And perhaps one of the final things is, it sounds as if we're going to have to go on a journey of unlearning in order to relearn, because for the longest part, I think we've learned certain behaviors about how we engage as Africans and Europeans. And I maybe just want to also start off the conversation by highlighting one of the points made by the president of Mozambique. He said, it was not so much that we needed fish, but what we actually needed were fishing rods. A very big thank you to my panelists who have joined me here this afternoon. And maybe, Kunz, I'm going to start right off with you, because there is an opportunity on the horizon. The Cotonou Agreement is coming to an end, I think this time about next year. And the question to you is, what new possibilities does this then bring to the surface to really move and transition to a relationship based on partnership?
Well, thanks a lot. I mean, you're raising the right questions. Now, Cotonou. Obviously, this is an important negotiation. I mean, we have a treaty between Europe and the 79 countries from Africa, the Caribbean, and Pacific. This treaty was negotiated in the 1990s and started in the year 2000. Obviously, in the meantime, the world has changed. Our relation with Africa has changed, and so renegotiating a new treaty is definitely an opportunity to set our relationship on a new footing. Now, obviously, treaties shape a relation, but they're not the alpha and the omega. And I think that underlying it, and what will define this treaty, is much more momentous change that is happening. I think the first one is indeed about the mindset. We are definitely not where we should be when it comes to mindset, but still a lot has been changing. And I think, and it may be counterintuitive, but to a certain extent, the migration crisis which we have all lived in 2015, 2016, has been absolutely, how should I say, an opportunity not to miss, because it has opened the eyes across Europe that what happens in Africa actually matters to Europe. It is not an isolated continent, it is a twin partner. And even if we started looking at each other in a different way through this narrow and rather negative angle of migration, we are now gradually broadening the view and starting to look at Africa as a continent of opportunity. And I think that a conference like this, and there are plenty of them across Europe, shows that. Now, this secondly has a major impact on what we do together. And I think it was very appropriate as this morning, this session started with a session with African entrepreneurs. I cannot insist on how important it is. And part of what I'm doing is trying to bring that to the fore. There's a lot of activity happening in Africa. 80% of Africa's young people, opinion polls show, want to be entrepreneurs. And if I look at the dynamism of what is happening in agri-tech, in fintech, in lots of issues, even on social entrepreneurship, but I'm sure Eugene will enter into that. I mean, this is incredibly important, and that's where Europe and Africa need to link up. I can develop some of that later. And there's maybe a third and last point I would want to mention. It is how we work together. We come out of a period when indeed it was very much about Africa asking and Europe giving. Before the Abidjan Summit in 2017, we did an opinion, there was a survey done, and one of the most, let's say, impactful quotes that I read in that service was that some of our African partners said, Europe, it's like an ATM machine. It will give you the money, but first, during half an hour, you'll need to listen to them patronizing you. And I think that that is absolutely a change we need to make. We need not to discuss with each other as a donor and a recipient, but as real partners that need to define a common agenda, and that is happening.
Thank you very much for being very frank and authentic in raising some of these issues. And you raised three important points that I do want to circle back to. The conversation of migration, we're going to definitely touch on that. Entrepreneurship, and in particular, how do we use trade and investment more as a way of moving away from the donor-recipient relationship. But you speak now also around the question of agency and how we play our respective roles. So Jacinta, I want to bring that link to you with this particular question. How do we ensure that African countries and Africans assume a greater role and a greater sense of agency when it comes to the agenda setting of this new partnership that we speak about? Because if we're talking about partnership and we're saying Europe sets the framework for the partnership and the agenda of what sits in that partnership, then I think we're using the wrong word. It probably isn't partnership. Your views and thoughts on that. How do we have greater agency? How do we play a more meaningful role as Africans?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I think you need to focus on in terms of what you intend doing. And I come from the energy sector, and we're a South African company who basically build out a fair amount of renewable energy projects, not just in South Africa, but across the African continent. And we looked at it as a partnership in terms of what we want. A partnership with government in terms of looking at how you can actually deliver clean energy into a particular market. And I think that's what we really need to look at, is how do you actually build that partnership? We had something to offer, respective government needed it, or a particular corporate in that country needed it, and we then moved forward in terms of a mutually beneficial relationship. And I think that's what you need to do. It shouldn't be just, and we do compete with a fair number of donors in terms of what we do. Many donors can actually do the exact same thing we can, but we feel you can make this into a business, and we've proven that we could.
And so what you're raising is the significance of the institutional framework as a starting point. Now, ladies and gentlemen, one of you in the audience has been fast off the mark and has already started to send questions to the panel. Please join this lonely figure and send more questions. What I will do is I will find ways of integrating your voice into this conversation, so you're not watching a conversation, but you're part of a conversation. So Eugene, let me come to you next. And I want to raise this question of this institutional framework. I mean, it could be trade policies, it could be government legislation. Is this the starting point? Is this the way we build the base for the partnership? If we were to think about the partnership in the analogy of a house, is this where we put the foundation of the house to say, make sure that the rules of engagement lean and push us towards a partnership, and then we build on mindset after that?
Thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers for bringing all of us here to deliberate on these important matters that affect both of our continents. Absolutely. I mean, trade, infrastructural policies such as trade policies and so on are critical in setting the standards and setting the terms upon which two continents such as Africa and Europe might engage. In fact, whether it is based on research collaboration or health or support in any form, we absolutely need the policies, the infrastructural policies, to set the tone. However, I'm sure all of us will agree that infrastructural policies go beyond a simple set of protocols for intergovernmental and intercontinental exchange. It more crucially has to do with the underlying assumptions that shape expectations and drive outcomes. And in that regard, I have found that as I interact more with both state and some state and non-state actors in West Africa, for instance, there's a shared sense that there's a way in which Africa is deemed to be a policy taker and not necessarily a co-author of those policies.
Right.
And that affects how those policies are appreciated, encoded, diffused within the African region, and implemented,
Yeah.
as opposed to simply shifting the responsibility to consultants, most of which, in most instances, are also foreigners.
Yeah.
So that further complicates the problem there. And I would like to cite two examples to perhaps dramatize the point. Somewhere in the 2000s, the European Union set up a regime for aflatoxins from Africa, products involving aflatoxins from Africa, that were estimated to impact African producers to the tune of something around $700 million. The problem was that the regime was unilaterally implemented.
Yeah.
African producers and actors were not active participants in authoring that particular process. And that affected drastically the understanding of the project and how it was implemented. And when you take a critical look at most of the partnerships that have existed in the past, the deficiencies oftentimes can be traced to a deficiency in understanding of the policy, and for that matter, a sense of ownership of it and its implementation. So I think that is absolutely critical. Another instance that dramatizes the point for me is when it comes to money laundering. So we know that, for instance, about 30% of Africa's wealth is siphoned out of the continent, but largely through European banks.
Yeah.
And we do see that when it comes to, again, the issue of standards, we do not see that fairness or that reciprocity. Because when it comes to Africans' way of living, we have less stringent measures, although it can be shown that there is some collusion between banks that are operating in Europe and so on. But when it comes to fruits and vegetables, for instance,
I have to stop you because I'm watching our clock and I see that we're running out of time. And there's a quick question here that I want you to pick up on, Eugene, and it's come from the audience, and it says, I hear everything that you're saying, but is governance in place to even ensure that funds are really used for the greater good of society when they make their way into Africa? This is coming from the audience, and I just want a quick yes or no.
Well, absolutely. And I want to point out that one of the things that must change in our appreciation of solving problems in Africa and bordering the relationship between the two continents is to give a lot more attention to the private sector.
Yeah.
Now, something very transformational is happening in Africa, which is that a lot of the problems, even social ones that are conventionally assumed to be the responsibility of government, such as provision of security, such as provision of social amenities and so on, are being undertaken by entrepreneurs. Social entrepreneurs are solving these problems. My organization is solving the problem of medicinal counterfeiting, a problem which is clearly a responsibility of government. So we obviously need to focus more on private actors who are solving problems through entrepreneurship. And when we do that, the funds will go into areas
So, Kunz, I know you want to jump in, and there's a question from the audience directly to you, but Michael, I want to bring your voice in because we're talking about institutional frameworks in the form of legislation in terms of policies, but I want to talk about institutional frameworks in the form of educational institutions. We find ourselves today sitting in an amazing business school, and as I walked in this morning, my question was, to what extent is this also a place where there is a deliberate focus on reconfiguring mindsets of the emerging leaders that are coming out of this very institution so that as they engage with Africans and in Africa, it's from a different perspective. The role of educational institutions.
Well, education is absolutely key. To inject a note of levity, when I was at one of these horrible British boarding schools many, many decades ago, my only friend was a young Nigerian, Mr. Alatije Vebutameta, for my Nigerian friends here. And we started disruptive partnerships at this boarding school in England, importing cigarettes, importing food, to get away from the disgusting British food at this boarding school. So I've had a lot of experience over the years in disruptive partnerships with African friends. But anyway, to be more serious, I've left Oxford Analytica before anybody asks me, is this the same thing as Cambridge Analytica, please? And I'm now working for the European University School of Transnational Governance, which is actually headed by a fine Portuguese who many of you know, Miguel Maduro. And thanks to, I have to say this, thanks to a very far-sighted support from the European Union, from actually Cohen's DEFCO, we're starting a new program of African leadership, African training and education and leadership for mid-career, high-potential African partners from public and private sectors. But the whole point I want to say here is that this is not Europe trying to impose some sort of training. It is being co-created with African companies, African institutions, African organizations on key transnational issues like digital governance, like sustainability, women's empowerment, judicial regulatory issues, regional governance. And again, the point about all of this really is, I think this sort of theoretical point here is that we know that the entrepreneurial sector, you've said 80% of young Africans want to be entrepreneurs, is probably, isn't it really, the entrepreneurial sector that is driving the pace of change in Africa today. And in a sense, and we were talking about this earlier, it's like governments in a way have to catch up. So the point of this transnational program at the European University is to try and instill a new, or co-create with our African partners, a new visionary leadership in public policy, in governance, so that we can further empower the entrepreneurial spirit that is driving progress in Africa today. And my last point is that, although again this is funded by the European Union with a great sort of visionary investment, it's African partners, African companies, and African institutions who I've been delighted to see in my 1 month starting this program, who are coming with us and running this together with us. So it's a real African-European partnership.
So we're beginning to see partnerships taking place. But before I move on, I know you wanted to jump into something, and there is an audience question that has got your name in it. So I need to bring that to you. So very quickly, Konzo, what was your contribution to Eugene?
I wanted to have 2 comments on what Eugene said. First of all, I would really like us to shift away from solving Africans' problems to supporting African solutions, because that's what we see across the continent. We see African solutions, and in my line of business, international cooperation, that's what I want to shift our support to. It is supporting African solutions. Now, those solutions are, and there I fully confirm what Eugene says, those solutions are very often entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
And that's not just about making money in, let's say, what we consider traditionally business sectors. But we are supporting companies that are bringing entrepreneurial solutions to an issue like waste management in Lagos. We see entrepreneurial solutions, I mean, Eugene's company is doing that, on the issue of trafficked medicine. We see across the continent how entrepreneurs are bringing solutions to societal issues, which from our point of view, very often we would expect governments to do that. But in Africa, it's the private sector. And I think that where we need to be, in my line of business, is to support that. And if we do so, that takes us also away from the traditional institutional logic of how we structure our partnership. We need to top, or basically base our institutional framework on something that is much broader and much deeper, at the level of societies, at the level of private sector, at the level of students. And that's, I think, what should drive this emergence of a new type of partnership between Africa and Europe. It is very real, and it is happening already, but we need to more radically shift the mindset and where we put our support.
So as I bring the question to you, it links very much to what you're saying. And we know what the research tells us. The research tells us that donor funding actually crowds out private sector activity. And in particular, it can even stifle the growth of local industries. So there isn't just a case for shifting mindset. There's a business case that says if you want to grow the local industry, if you want to see private sector growth, you have to rethink whether you are over-flooding the market with donor funding. But the question then that comes from the audience, and I think links to this theme, it says, to Mr. Duns, do you think that Europe should replace aid by investment? And it speaks exactly to this idea of channeling money into ideas, into entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, through investment instead of just donor funds.
It's not about shifting from aid to investment. I think it is absolutely crucial that Europe maintains and even increases the available official development aid funding for Africa. And by the way, in our proposal for the next budget, we are increasing it. It is not about the size of ODA. It is about how we use the ODA. And here we are seeing how we've started this transition, how we are using more and more ODA as a facilitator for private sector investment, local private sector investment. One of the biggest barriers, if you look at the surveys done with African entrepreneurs, one of the big issues they face is access to finance. They've got a business, they want to grow. They go to a bank, interest rate 28%. Impossible. Why? Not because the risk is high, but because the perceived risk is high. That's where we intervene. We are going to provide, with ODA, guarantees to banks that de-risk. We say, if it goes bust, we take a first loss. We use our grant money. And that's what we want to do. The same in the area of skills. There's a lot of need for training, for mentoring. A startup starts to grow. What the startup people tell me then is, I mean, if you run a company of 50 people or a company of 200 or 300, that's a totally different business model. What can you do to help us manage that transition? And there again, we are providing help from Europe, but also African help. If I look at a foundation like the Tony Elumelu Foundation, the big Nigerian entrepreneur who has set up this foundation to help African entrepreneurs, well, we want to work with him. We want to work with that foundation to help startups train and move to the next level. And I think that that's where we need to move ODA.
And it's interesting because I think up until this point, the conversation has been about replace donor funds with investment. And you're saying, depending on how you use the funds, if I'm understanding you correctly. And I want to test that idea with the panel because there are these ideas of blended financing instruments. There is early risk investment. And I mean, we were listening to the experience of Mozambique, where we know that in the process of rebuilding entire markets, sometimes you need to de-risk the investment that comes into that market. So it is about how we use it and not so much the quantity of what's in the market. So I want to test that. And maybe to bring to you, Cassandra, is this idea that what is also bubbling under is that we need to see that investment coming from Europe, coming into African entrepreneurship and African private sector. What needs to be true from an African perspective to be increasingly attractive for European investors? What do you think as Africans we still need to get right if we are going to attract more funds and we are going to attract more investment into the markets?
Thank you. So I think first and foremost is the sense of urgency. And I'm taking this question from an infrastructure perspective. So a sense of urgency to get things done. And not changing the rules as you go through a process in order to secure the funding, in order to close the deal, if I could call it that. And 9 out of 10 times, this is what ultimately delays the ability to secure private sector investing and actually acts as a deterrent for private sector investors to partner with you as you move forward in developing or building out a particular project. And to me, if we can get that right, and that's basically a buy-in from government as well as corporate Africa in terms of actually, if we can get that right, we will definitely see an ability to expedite access to capital. But in addition to that, also make it more attractive for private investors to partner with you.
Yeah. So a case for making it a little bit more attractive. And I want to hear your voice on this, Eugene. How do we make sure that if we're saying investment in trade is the alternative, how do we ensure that we're attracting the right kind of funds? We're attracting the investment and the trade onto African markets?
I think, first of all, it depends on the readiness of Africans, our leadership in our market itself. And it is important to point out that certain African countries have already started setting ambitious targets for themselves.
Yeah.
The Ghanaian president, for instance, has outdoored a document that seeks to put Ghana beyond aid within a certain framework. So feeding global support into such local actions and efforts itself is useful. But also, I think we cannot overemphasize the need to be a lot more strategic when it comes to Africa, because the continent is assuming a certain form of dynamism that perhaps has never been seen before. It is important to identify critical areas in the private sector, people who are on the grounds, demonstrating African ingenuity, unleashing African creativity, confronting African problems on a daily basis, especially those that are of social in nature, solving them and supporting those. I think that doing that will ensure we spend the funds, the limited funds, on areas that will yield the greatest trickle-down effect.
Yeah.
So in terms of investment direction, I think that number one, we should tie it into the ambitious documents that are being created by the African countries themselves, the initiatives that are being taken on the grounds. And then we ought to focus a lot more away from the status approach, but focus on entrepreneurship, African young people who are living on the continent, facing the problems, designing solutions, and confronting those
So
challenges.
let me be a little bit controversial on this point, and I'm speaking as a South African. We seem to have a very good capability of putting together plans and documents. And then we have an even better capability of letting them gather dust somewhere on somebody's cupboard, right? So the question that I want to bring back to you is, beyond the planning, beyond putting together the ideas, what needs to be true to see the momentum on the ground? Because I think it is momentum that attracts capital. It is actual signs of growth that is going to unlock even greater investment. And I'm keen just to get a quick thought from you, Eugene, on that.
I will challenge you right back and question whether indeed there are enough well thought through blueprints in Africa that are not working and simply gathering dust. We quite often hear that we are good at formulating plans, but we never implement them. If you check some of the ones that I have taken a practical look at, the programs and policies that have suffered in implementation stage are those that were not exactly properly thought through. So we do need a lot more rigorous thinking at the
Jacinda doesn't
ideas
agree.
formulation stage.
No.
Jacinda doesn't agree. Jacinda?
I think there's some great plans there, but because we tend to change the rules and the way in which we implement midstream, 9 out of 10 times that stops development happening or investment from actually occurring. And you see that time and time again. I work across multiple African countries, and that is my common problem, is the fact that we go in, yes, a fantastic plan, but midway we want to change it, and when we change it, we lose 2 years. And losing 2 years in the African continent is not a big deal.
Michael,
Well,
so are you gonna put this wrestling back, sort it out for me?
No, just very rapidly. I mean, I think it's fantastic that we're focusing on entrepreneurs and on the entrepreneurial drive. And it's fantastic that, for instance, DevCo and the European Union is focusing on private sector support, like IFC and the World Bank, in a way, where I used to work too, private sector development. But the public policy side can't be forgotten.
Yeah.
Because if we're moving ahead so well on the private sector side, if we're moving ahead so well in terms of this entrepreneurial spirit, but the government regulatory processes are not there, and the public policy processes are not there, then it'll be a brake rather than an enabler. It'll be an impediment rather than empowering. So I think we've got to do more work, and again, that comes back to this program that I'm involved with, also to make sure that public policy leadership is up to speed with the entrepreneurial side.
So I'm keen to get to your examples of some of the projects you're already doing, Koens. But before I do that, Michael, very quickly, it's a comment, it's a statement, and I'd love to just get your reaction to the statement. It says, if we need more capital flow into African opportunities, shouldn't we start by fixing the people flow between African and European countries, especially with the education exchange flow of people and knowledge? And I think this is exactly what you're talking about.
Well, yes, it is. And of course, in so many places you'll find people going to the US or to the UK to study because they have these fine old universities, and perhaps not going back and having this brain drain. But I think Tunde and others said on the first panel this morning, there's much more attraction now to go back to Africa. I know some of you, there's this Nigerian group here that is also encouraging people to go back to work in attractive investment opportunities there. The other thing is, of course, is African universities themselves. And I know that my European university is working with African universities in partnerships. I'm sure that this fine Portuguese school that we have here is also doing that. So in a way, yes, more partnerships. There's obviously more attraction to going back and working on investment opportunities in Africa, and more jointly run programs, I think, like we're doing. I hope that's the answer.
So, Koens, before I ask you a question, I think you want to jump into this conversation quickly.
I just want to make 2 points. The first one is about public policy, because I think this is obviously essential. Now, when we drive a public policy reform agenda in abstract, independently from what private sector wants, then we are basically asking our partners to make a regulatory effort without being sure that there will be low-hanging fruit. So you ask people to make an effort without showing the benefits. And that doesn't work. And we've seen it in the past many times. It doesn't work. Politically, this doesn't work. Which is why we now want to turn this upside down and discuss with the private sector, with African private sector, where do you see the opportunities? What is going to happen? And then what are the issues you see, notably related to public policy, regulatory environment, business climate, and so on, which we will then support, again, through our international cooperation. And then we get the right cocktail, the cocktail of reforms, but also of bringing things on the ground, which links back to the other point you made, which is, what about the plans and the strategies? I think that the key issue is not that we lack plans, but that very often they remain at a strategic level. One of the greatest books, which was recently about grand strategy, says that a key point of strategy is you need an adequacy between your goals and your means. Very often, when we identify strategy, we stick to the macro level. Now, a proper strategy needs to be articulated. If you look at it the way the military does it, you have a strategy, you have tactical moves, and you have operational moves. And very often when we do these plans, we are sloppy. We define the grand strategy, but we do not articulate it in terms of what exactly the means are. Can we actually reach those objectives? And so I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. Again, to make sure that your grand strategy articulates ultimately and is into something that can be done, you need your key actors on board. And I repeat, one of the key actors I see now as really emerging on the African continent is the private sector.
Is the private sector. So, and thank you for that contribution, especially around the distillation of those plans into strategies and actual tactics and operational components. But I am aware that the European Commission has really tried to embrace this idea of partnerships as the framework and the backbone of the projects that you are now currently doing on the ground. Granted, it's early days, but I'd be keen to hear from you to say, well, this thing that we're talking about, is it working on the ground? And where are some of the stubborn constraints that continue to impede you as the Commission into full partnership on the ground?
I think it's starting to work. I mean, first of all, we've tried to capture this new approach last year when President Juncker, the Commission President Juncker, presented a new, approach, very much focused on investment and job creation. And one of the innovations of this was the creation of 4 sectoral task forces, which were composed of top politicians, representatives of the private sector, and academics, think tanks, at a parity basis with Africans and Europeans in 4 areas: energy, transport connectivity, digital economy, and agriculture and agri-food. And they have worked together over the space of 8 months and have produced a set of recommendations, some of which are absolutely interesting and useful. They give us a sense of where we need to go. I couple it back to what I started. This brings us to a more concrete level, translating strategy into something more concrete. Now, much more work is needed. We're going to continue the work on the basis of these recommendations with the private sector, again, European and African, with think tanks, European, African, with policymakers, European, Africans, to see how we can best, in the next budgetary cycle, program our development aid in a way that is actually an enabler of all these things that are happening.
So our time's just been slashed to 2.5 minutes, so please bear with me as I try to pull a rabbit out of a hat. Cassandra, very quickly, this morning we heard about the threat of China overtaking the relationship between Europe and Africa. As an African who's looking for investment opportunities, do you think that the European approach to relationships with Africans is at risk, and that it's going to be outpaced and left behind, given the context of what the Chinese are doing on the continent?
I think it would, just having had exposure on both sides. I think to a large extent, when we see the Chinese come in, and I'm going to say that the Chinese come into any project, they're there to get it done, first and foremost. And what tends to happen is that the negotiation, to a large extent, happens later. And then you get trapped in it in terms of what that outcome of that negotiation actually results. From a European perspective, it's more, front-based in terms of let's get the agreement in place, let's do all of this, etc. To such an extent that there's years of delay before actually something really happens. And people want to see things happen.
Yeah.
The African continent has been patient for a very, very long time, and I think they want to see things happen. So that strategy needs to change in terms of how do we actually get things done.
Okay, so we've got less than a minute left, and I'd like to close this conversation in this way. So as you can see, there are cameras, the media is here, everybody's looking for the next headline that is going to come from this conversation, because that's what they're going to run with in this evening's news. So what we're going to do as a panel is that we're going to give the headline that is going to run on this evening's news. And your headline is going to start off with equal partnership. It's one sentence. It's not an editorial. It's not an executive summary. It's one sentence. Equal partnership, and I want you to complete the sentence. Michael, you seem very keen, so I'm going to let you go first.
Well, I think this forum has it. I mean, equal partnership, Africa's time has come, and Europe is finally responding with an equal partnership.
So it's a double page, but it's a good headline. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, Michael. So if Coins is looking away from me, which generally means please move on. So let me go to the end. Eugene, let me come to you. Equal partnership, 7 p.m. on the news. What is the headline going to read?
Equal partnerships in pursuance of shared prosperity.
Equal partnerships in pursuit of shared prosperity. Jasandra.
Equal partnerships to make Africa great again.
Equal partnerships to make Africa great again.
Oh, no,
very naughty. Very naughty. Okay, so you've got the task of taking us home, Guns. Equal partnerships.
It's happening now.
Equal partnerships, it's happening now. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for my panelists. Thank you very much.